Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another weekly session. I'm Meryl Stewart, CEO of Marketing and Business Solutions. And today we are talking about how you can effectively lead your sales and fundraising professionals in your business or organization. And I'm thrilled to have my colleague Jamie Renee join me for today's conversation. She leads her own company, Good Day Solutions, but she also works as a principal for many of our client engagements. And together, I know, Jamie, this sounds like we're going to be really old, but we have over 40 years experience working in for-profit sales and marketing and nonprofit fundraising and leadership. So I'm thrilled to have her on board today to talk through this with me. I know we've had a number of clients and people reach out with questions on how they help their sales and fundraising professionals be successful, especially during this time. It's a bit challenging out there in some industries to raise funds or to sell, and instead of cutting their teams, they're looking at how do we really help lift them up so that they can be successful and help the business grow. So, are you ready to get started with this, Jamie?
I'm ready.
All right. So, let's start at a place that I think is fitting, which is to kind of talk through what are some best practices on managing people. So, I'll let you go first, and then I'll kind of chime in with some additional thoughts as we go.
Yeah, it's interesting when I talk with leaders who it's a CEO or the COO and they're overseeing a sales team or a development team, and they'll say, I don't know how to manage these people. And it's probably in part because most salespeople have very big personalities and also exude confidence, which is necessary in order to be successful. But the bottom line is, when you're managing people, there are just some basic fundamentals that you have to keep in mind. The first is you have to see them as a person. You cannot see them just as their goals or as the function of their role. You have to see them as an individual, and you can't typecast them. If you've met one salesperson, you've met one salesperson, and so you need to take the time to really get to know them. You've also got to provide very clear direction. Salespeople tend to be very self-motivated, and they will, as mavericks, figure out a way to get things done. And so in general, when you're dealing with people, if you're going to be the leader, you've got to be able to provide clear direction. You also have to be able to maintain trust. Trust is absolutely key in any relationship, and it's certainly true for professional relationships as well, which means you've got to be consistent, you've got to be fair, you've got to be transparent, and you've also got to do what you say that you're going to do when you say you're going to do it, which can be difficult for some folks, but you've got to be able to maintain trust. You've also got to listen. The vast majority of leaders love hearing themselves talk, but if you're leading people, you need to shut up and listen to what it is that they have to say. You should be doing less of the talking, and you should be talking last if you're the leader. You really need to focus on active listening. You've also got to provide them with support. What support do they need to get their job done? Whether that's people support or resources or tools, they need to be able to know that they can count on you to equip them. So if you're leading people, you need to be able to prepare to resource them to do their job. The other is you definitely need to address and solve problems. Being the leader means you have to deal with the difficult things. And so if you're managing people, they expect if they bring a problem to you, regardless of the size of the problem, you're going to address it. You're going to address it in a timely manner, and you're going to solve the situation for them. They're also looking for accountability. People ultimately will do what they know is being measured. And so when you're managing people, you have to have clear expectations and a clear way to hold them accountable. But you've got to leave room for them to grow. And it's not enough just to think that they're going to develop on their own. You've got to ask about it. When you're dealing with people, you want them to continue to grow in their understanding of the trends within the industry and also understanding the competitors. And so you should definitely be asking questions about what have you learned, and that will influence their behavior. And I think the other thing is you've got to leave room for them to fail. When you're managing people, it is impossible for them to always be successful. And you don't want them to be playing it so safe that everything they do is a success. So you've got to leave room for them to take risks and for them to fail, and fail in a way where they still feel supported.
Well, and I think it's important too, because we learn best by those failures, how to pick ourselves up and move on to the next thing. And if we never have any, then it's really hard for us to to learn from our mistakes and carry that with us into the next scenario. And you and I have talked about this. There's other things too that leaders need to remember, and some of that is why an employee or professional might be dissatisfied, with their role. So a couple of the things, I know you and I have chatted about this, but sharing with everyone, reasons people are dissatisfied, there's five kind of top reasons. The first one is they're just in the wrong role. They're not meant to do sales. They're not meant to do fundraising. Maybe it's something they've tried or they've shown interest in. And so, this was the shot that they had to be able to test out their skills, but maybe it's just not the right fit. And I know in leadership roles that I've been in, as well as you, Jamie, that we've, I think both of us have leaned into what are the talents and strengths that people bring to the table, and how do we capitalize on that? And then how do we build the rest of our teams based on the weaknesses or the gaps that there are, so that we're playing to everyone's strengths as much as possible and not putting people in a position of failure. So sometimes they're just in the wrong role, and that needs to change. The second reason could be that they don't feel like they have the support that they need. Maybe they don't have the right materials to tell the story. Maybe the team doesn't have training on how to work as a cohesive group. And sometimes leadership needs help, in staying out of the weeds and letting people do their jobs and letting people, shine their talents, as opposed to getting into the mix of every single detail, and take more of that kind of advisory or 30,000 foot view level in guiding people to be successful instead of the day-to-day management. So, helping people feel like they're supported is a really important piece. I remember going through a training once and someone said, you can't make people successful, but what you can do is you can arm them with the tools to be successful, and it's up to them whether or not they're going to use those tools and work, through their routines and their expectations to be successful. So if you don't arm people, with the right tools, it's hard for them sometimes to do their jobs. The third piece is that they may not be properly trained. So, sometimes you get lucky and you get people that have an amazing amount of knowledge or ability, but they need additional training, or they're new to an industry or a profession and they need additional training. So, not being afraid to invest as a leader in the training of your professionals. Don't just assume that just because they took the job and came to the table and said that they're amazing at all the things on their resume, that they're, that they have all those tools. So, properly training people is very important. The fourth reason that people kind of get dissatisfied is that they don't have the proper skills, meaning that, maybe they're really good at prospecting, but then when they get in front of somebody, they're not listening. They're talking over people, they're jumping to the next element of the presentation, and they're not really listening to what it is that customer or that prospect needs. Or maybe they're really good at pitching, but they're not good at closing. They just can't find the tools to finish that deal or finish that donation to move on, to the next element of the process. So it's kind of being aware of what strengths and weaknesses your team has that align with those skills, because they're really essential to the sales or fundraising process, really, when you're working with others. And the fifth reason is if they're managing other people, they need to have strong organization, time management, people skills. They have to be able to listen and motivate others and inspire them to do their jobs and hold people accountable, and deal with conflict resolution. And sometimes, we elevate people to positions that maybe they're not ready for, or they don't have that built-in skill set to do it. So, really making sure that if you're doing that with your team and from a leadership perspective, that you understand where there might be some gaps in understanding or knowledge with your employees to help them be more successful, especially if that's an area of growth. There's also some, barriers to success. So, I think probably one of the number one things is people have a fear of being rejected. What if I do something and someone says no, or I present an idea and people say it's not good enough, whatever that is. So there's definitely a fear of rejection. I don't think any of us want to feel that way. Another barrier of success is, poor communication skills, where, there really needs to be more listening than talking, as you alluded to in the beginning, and really matching kind of the need, the wants, the pain points, with solutions and products and services, really being an active listener to understand how you can take what you have as a business, a salesperson, a fundraiser, an organization, and match it with someone's interest or solving a problem. We've talked a lot about value proposition on these broadcasts, and that definitely comes into play. And then another barrier to success is they just don't have the marketing support. I know right now, and we talked about this in the very beginning, but a lot of people are cutting their marketing teams, they're cutting their fundraising teams, they're cutting their sales teams. And I say kind of pull back on that for a minute. You're cutting off the very arm in which you have professionals to help you generate business, help you generate money, help generate awareness. And sometimes if people don't have the marketing support, meaning the content, collateral, lead generation, ability to retain customers or donors, they're not going to be successful at their job. I mean, they can't do everything. So you got to make sure that if you're cutting in certain areas, that you know how you're going to facilitate those skills or that part of the process to someone else to help, support the team. And the last is really lack of an effective sales plan and process. If you don't know where you're trying to go, then it's hard to get there. And so that strategy and plan is really important. And in the process, the steps in which your team follows to get there is just as important.
There's
Go ahead, Jamie.
There's two things that jump out, Meryl, when you were saying that fear of no, and whether it's fundraising or it's sales or you're going to ask somebody out on a date, there's always the fear of rejection, right? One of the things that we did with a company that I managed is we measured and tracked the no's, and we gave an award for the person that got the most no's. So we sort of made it fun. There's a great book that says Go for No, which helps you kind of get over your anxiety and talks about if you're not pushing for the no, you don't know how far the actual conversation can go. And another great thing to do to address some of those common obstacles that you brought up is role playing. People fear the unknown. And once you do it enough times, you sort of get into the water, it's not as scary. So if you can role play within your sales team and allow someone to act like the, crazy donor or crazy client, and everyone giggles as you try to navigate yourself through the conversation, it just makes it a little less fearful. And
Agreed.
that when you get to the sales meeting, that everyone's going to want to hear your funny story about how you got the no.
Yeah, no, it does make a difference when you can actively role play and practice those skills. Even if it's just in a fun environment with colleagues or other leadership, it does kind of desensitize that fear. So that when you go get in front of a client or a potential donor, that you're not as afraid. The other thing, and I know you and I've worked on these types of projects together, but a lot of times no just means not right now, and it doesn't necessarily, no, I never want to do it. No, you suck, and I think that, you should just go somewhere else. I mean, it's not necessarily that. It's just, no, this isn't a fit right now. Or, yes, I'm interested in what you have to say, but this one piece that you're presenting isn't the right fit, so go back and present something else that maybe better aligns with my need, that you might have a solution for. So, I think sometimes we take things very literally and personally as humans, and sometimes it's, it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to escalate to that level. So another thing, Jamie, I know we want to talk about, and I know this is a question that we get from folks, is what does the CEO need to evaluate to ensure that the sales team and the director are on track? What does that look like for leadership?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can go about it, but to keep it simple, the first and foremost is that they need to understand the strategy. So if you've empowered the chief development officer or the head of sales to run their department, then you need to understand what strategy do they have in place and ensure that it's aligned with your organizational goals. And that should be a couple-hour meeting that is done around the time that you're setting your annual goals. The next is operations. What processes are they following? And that would include their sales process, but it also includes people management. You need to be paying attention. Do they have the right culture? Is there a growth mindset? Is there lateral awareness? Are they retaining folks? Are their people generally happy and productive, so that you know if they're effective at inspiring and leading their team. And then the third is the analysis, or the score, if you will. You need to know how they're breaking those large goals into bite-sized pieces and what the score is and scoreboard is at any given time. And that typically is what people are checking in on. But the process is equally important. The place to get there, the culture and the people, making sure that they're happy is equally important, and being assured ahead of time that the strategy is aligned with your organizational goals is critical.
So, another thing that I know that we talk about is really, and you kind of touched on this from an analysis perspective and measuring kind of what matters and tracking results. And so, how do you build a team to drive results? What are the components of building a sales team? And I can talk a little bit about it from the fundraising side, but I'll let you start. How do you build the right team? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, and I've led both sales and fundraising teams. It'll be interesting to hear you distinguish between the different characteristics that makes us for a successful fundraiser, makes for a successful salesperson. And I think in today's climate, those two are getting closer aligned, but there still are some distinctions between the two.
Yeah, there are.
So it'll be interesting to hear from your perspective. The first for me is, whether it's sales or fundraising, but definitely if it's sales, they need to be results oriented. This needs to be something that is driven by goals. So you have to build the right team by making sure that they are motivated, they're driven by goals, and they need to be a lifelong learner. I mean, think about it. Your salesperson is learning a new product, learning a new service, learning a new competitor, learning a new trend, learning a new client, and having to connect the dots all the time. If they're not someone that is thirsty to constantly be learning, they're probably not in the right role, and definitely self-driven. If there's so much free time, autonomy that comes along with sales and even fundraising, that they're not someone that it can direct and manage their own time, you're going to have great difficulty in keeping them motivated and on track.
Yeah, I would agree.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I would agree, especially from the fundraising side. I mean, you have to be driven by results. I mean, there should be fundraising goals. The team has to be, working towards an overall goal for the organization, but then individual goals typically. I mean, you see that in, annual giving and major gifts and grant writing, in corporate giving. Everyone should know exactly what they need to produce in order to be measured against an effective goal. And so, when it comes to performance time, I think that there's other things that definitely tie into both sides, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the financial goal and performance there is really important. The other side that's measured, a lot, and I know this is true for sales team, is retention. And so it's really looking at what did we do financially, but then how did we retain the customers or the donors that we got, in the past year, or that we've had for the last decade. And so, I think fundraising professionals are mostly driven by the financial success piece, but that is also dependent on the impact that the organization measures and how impactful, a nonprofit organization says that their work is, and the change that it's actually affecting. It's kind of like sales, where you have a product or a service that is solving a problem. Well, in the case of the nonprofit, it's the mission, or the program alignment that is helping to solve an issue in the community or among a certain group of people. So if you can't prove the results of that work, then it makes it hard to fundraise. Makes it hard to reach your financial goals. But it's also a very vital piece to be, looking at from a performance standpoint, because fundraisers have to use that information and how they're linking people with a potential investment. So they do have to be results oriented. They have to be self starters. And like you said, there is some dead time. There's time in between the meetings that you have. There's time in between the proposals that you draft. There's time in between, the ask or the pitch, and then the cultivation of that. So yeah, it's very similar, different words, but similar, as far as performance goes.
Yeah, I think anytime you're dealing with someone who has to influence behavior, they certainly need to be personable. If
Yes.
you need to know your target audience and your prospects, your clients enough to know, is this personality, this person going to resonate with them? Are they going to see them as
Right.
credible? Are they going to want to take a call, take a meeting, spend time with them, give them business, hear from them on a regular basis? And so you definitely need someone that is, personable as well. But as a sales leader, when you're talking about your different individual salespeople, and they're not all going to be the same, and your different sort of tracks and territories and verticals would lend themselves to want, a variety of salespeople on your team. It's equally important to know what motivates them, and then have incentives in place. There's a high
Right.
turnover with sales. I know there's also a high turnover with fundraising staff. And in part, it's because you get burnt out. It is a very
Right.
demanding job. And the numbers don't lie. Everybody is measuring the numbers. Everyone has you under a microscope. So having some fun along the way and incentivizing them in ways that is ethical, but aligned with their individual goals and, is fair is also important.
The other thing that I think is important, and I know, a good salesperson is good at relationships, right? I mean, most people who do sales and have done so for a long period of time are good at relationship building and really knowing what their potential customer has a need for and how their product or service can, be a solution for that. But that is essential in fundraising. I mean, you don't become a good fundraiser or maintain momentum as a fundraiser unless it is built on relationships. And many times, I think in the sales world, especially, on the for-profit side, you can have transactions. You can have a transactional relationship with customers, where there's a short-term need or a short-term item or product or service that's being pushed out. But overall, the relationship elements are important in both, but essential in fundraising. And it's not just the fundraiser. Sometimes I think when people take jobs as fundraising professionals, the expectation is that, okay, that person's going to work miracles. They're going to go out in the community and raise millions of dollars by themselves. I, as a leader, don't really need to participate. None of my board members really need to be a part of that. That's their job. That's what they do. And that's not really how it works. I mean, in practice, that is not how it works. You have to have leadership involved because a donor or an investor wants to hear from the highest level person in the organization about where you're going and how you're going to maintain it and how are you going to grow or gain momentum on something you want to do. Sometimes that lead person has to be the CEO to make that case in front of an investor or donor. The other is because it's relational, board members have to be involved. It doesn't mean that everyone has to ask, but they have to play an active role in bringing people to the table, making introductions, being on donor calls, and cultivation calls to build that relationship and trust because of a relationship they have or they know of, to bring to the table. And so, yes, the fundraising person is ultimately in charge of making sure that there's enough stuff in the pipeline, that those relationships and momentum are being kept, but they really rely on the help of multiple individuals, all of which it's almost like an air traffic controller. Like you have all of these things happening at once, and you as the air traffic controller have to know exactly where to place people at the right time so you don't have a collision, right? And so that's very much kind of that fundraiser's role. So yes, they have to be able to be motivated to do their job and to keep moving, but at the same time, they really need the help of others within the organization to help make those introductions and maintain those relationships, which is slightly different than the sales process. I mean, a salesperson, if they have the right tools, can go tell the story and pitch it and sell it, and align them with people in the organization that can deliver on that promise. But it's just a little different. So what does it look like when, and I think about this from a donor perspective, but how do you distribute accounts? How do you align certain donors? And I can talk a little bit about that, but how do you align certain accounts in a sales process so that they're with the right person? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so in similar to fundraising, there's size of accounts and there's type of accounts, and so you need to make sure that someone's specialized in that. But it really comes down to your salespeople are problem solvers. So what's their area of subject matter expert at? What are they leaning into to understand the trends, understand the problems, understand the obstacles and the pain points of a particular industry? And then because they're passionate about it, because their personality resonates with the decision makers in that industry or in that vertical, you want to give them those types of accounts. But there's different people who retain counts, there's different people who earn counts, there's different people who service counts. So it's inside sales, outside sales, there's the hunters, there's the folks that actually retain. And so really knowing your people and knowing their strengths and knowing what's needed in that particular book of business or that account list is important, in matching them up. And they'll tell you who they are, but you'll see very quickly, is this someone who can maintain relationships, or is this someone who's really good at earning the relationship and then moves on to the next one?
Right. Yeah, and I would say it's pretty similar in fundraising. I mean, the accounts are distributed, typically by type of fundraising initiative. So you may have someone that's in charge of your special event donors versus your major gifts, which are a certain threshold and above, versus people who give annually, at maybe a lower amount. So it is similarly split up. And you're right, everybody is not the right fit for every relationship. Just because they're in your portfolio doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to connect best with you. And so I think as a good fundraiser or even a good salesperson, you also have to know when it is that you're not the right person, and that someone else needs to be part of that relationship building process or that sales process, so that you get the best results for the client or the customer or the donor, and not just because they're in your portfolio. And that's hard. That's hard to do because no one wants to lose a sale or lose the ability to count revenue as part of their goal. But it's also about what's in the best interest of the customer, and the long-term, result for the business, so that you can retain that, much, much further into the future. And I know part of that's defining goals. So take us through, how do people define clear goals?
Well, obviously, you need to look at your organizational goals and make sure whatever revenue is associated with ensuring that your business, remains in the black and is thriving and growing in their market share, that your goals are aligned with that. But the key with your sales goals is they need to be very, very, very clear. If part of it is around retention,
Mhm.
which is incredibly important, there's the saying, it's cheaper to keep a client than to get a new one or earn a new customer. And certainly if you want to upsell them or increase the size of the contract or the size of the gift, retention is important. And certainly if you want to ask for a referral, which should be part of your process as well, that's going to come after they've had a good experience with you. So retention is important. So a significant amount of your goals cannot just lean into the acquiring new customers. You have to have very clear goals that talk about retention, very clear goals that talk about servicing the accounts if accounts management is also under sales, and very clear goals about acquiring new customers. And you have to set realistic goals based on what the market
Yeah.
will bear. So it's not enough to just look, we're going to
Right.
grow by 2%. You need to know, do a market analysis and know what's possible. Who is your ideal client? Who is your ideal customer? And how many of them are within the sphere in which you're marketing, the territory in which you're working, and set your goals based on what's possible, not what you did last year, but what is possible this year. And that often will give you some stretch goals. But when your sales team knows that it's based in reality and based in fact, that this is something that's actually possible, it will motivate them in a way that just setting goals that are a 2% growth from year over year, or
Mhm.
a 5% growth from year over year, will never do.
Well, and I think it's especially important in kind of our economic environment right now, that just because someone hasn't been performing in the last, 60 to 90 days doesn't necessarily mean that, they shouldn't be with the organization. I think some other things to consider, on both sides, and I mean, this especially, ties into fundraising, but the environment is different. Everybody has had to pivot in some fashion from what their original plans were to something that's different right now. And so it may mean that, that major gift person that you had on board, or that salesperson that's had a certain vertical that they're selling in, maybe they have to pause on that, and you need to use their skill set somewhere else to help still generate funding, but not from the same source. And that's okay. I think everybody understands that pivoting is important right now. I think the worst thing an organization or a business can do is to just start cutting their sales and their fundraising teams. I know that there are definitely reasons that you would and that you should, but if you're basing it on what has happened in the last 60 days, it's not a good baseline for performance year over year. And so really going back to, how has this person performed in the past? What are the goals? Do we need to realign them to be more realistic right now for the next 3 to 6 months, because the environment has changed, so that you're setting people up for success as much as possible? And if they don't perform within a certain period of time from that point forward, then you maybe have some grounds to have some other discussions about performance. But I think it's really hard to take what's happening out there in the world and and say, okay, we have a different game, but you have the same tools. We expect the same results or more, and that there's no room for change. I think that leadership really has to take a hard look at, how do we pivot our business and set up our professionals for the best success that they can. And I know that's hard. Those are hard decisions and hard conversations. But it's never made sense to me, even as a marketing professional and a fundraiser, in positions that you cut the arm off of the revenue line, to your profits and growth, because of budget. You need to realign the budget. You need to realign expectations. And yes, there may be still some cutting, but you got to really take a hard look at that before you just start, getting rid of people that are helping you make money. So those are hard decisions. And I think, one of the things, Jamie, you and I have talked about is, how do you hold people accountable, so that those decisions become a little bit easier. So I know, we use the term one-on-ones, have a one-on-one discussion or one-on-one, meeting. How do you run an effective one-on-one meeting with a sales representative or a fundraising professional to hold them accountable?
Yeah, I'll answer that. But before I do, I'm thinking about my war days of being in the trenches with fundraising and sales, where I'm not, designing the strategy and aligning the resources, but I'm at the mercy of the strategy and at mercy of the resources that are available. And I think a reality that I feel as if my fellow sales and fundraisers would, frown upon me not saying, is that organizations create these mini crises within their organization all the time. And they do it in part by siloing out the sales, treating them as if they are this separate entity that has everything that they need, and they need to just go out and get the donor or get the sale. And nothing else within the organization is intertwined. There's no linked interdependencies. There's no shared goals. There's no united strategy. There's no lateral awareness. There's no team.
There's no shared accountability.
There isn't. And if everybody within your organization does not have a link to your revenue goals, you are setting yourself up for failure. Agreed. Everything that you're doing should be about ensuring that you're doing it in a way that a donor feels confident to invest in your mission. You're doing it in a way
go ahead.
That a client feels comfortable to buy a product and service from you. And so that is the way that you send your invoices. That is the way that you plan your marketing. That is your communication strategy. It is your hiring strategy. It is your brand placement. It is your culture. It is your leadership. It's the way your leaders show up in the community, in the other meetings that they're in. All of that has to be linked to your sales and your fundraising objectives. And if they're not seeing the success of the sales team or the success of the fundraising team as a direct reflection of their research and development, their product and development, or their programs, the measurements and impact of their programs and services, they are delusional, because the sales team can only yield what the other people are planting. They can only sell what is real.
Right. And they can only sell, especially in organizations, what the true impact is that the program metrics are showing. And so you're right, everybody should be tied to, ultimately the revenue goals for an organization or a business, because the sales and the fundraising team depend on those performance indicators to be able to make their case stronger to somebody that needs help with something. And if those are
Oh
weak,
yeah.
it makes it very difficult to make that case.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you how many companies will say, "Hey, my sales team is really failing." And then we start looking at what the sales team has, and it's, your product does not have a demand. These benefits and features that you spend a significant amount of money and resources on are not actually what the market wants. Did you do any client research? Did you do any customer focus groups? And that's the same thing true for donors. Sometimes nonprofits will build these programs and these plans, and people don't want to invest in it. And it doesn't mean that it's not a valuable program and service. It just
Right.
means it doesn't resonate with folks. And so you
Well, or
have to be testing.
Or people won't invest in it because you can't prove that it works.
Absolutely.
That organizations aren't tracking the appropriate metrics and impact measures to say, hey, if we provide this service or this program to individuals and we're trying to affect change in a specific area of human services, if you can't prove that it works, it makes it really hard to go to someone and say, we want your money to help make this better and to impact more people. And then they say, what have you done? And you can't tell that story. That
Right.
makes or breaks that investment. So it is really important. And I know that there is discord in many cases between other parts of businesses and organizations and their performance and how it impacts fundraising or sales. And most people don't want to tie them all together. It's kind of like, you were hired to go do this, go do it. You're going to be amazing. Go get the money. It's not that simple. And so the more that as a leader, you can kind of connect the dots of what are all the pieces that I need to help someone be successful across the organization, across the business, the more successful they will be, and the more that the organization or business will grow. But you have to have that insight and be willing to look at that, which is difficult sometimes. That's not an easy thing to kind of absorb and, look across the board and say what's working and what's not, and pivot and adjust. But good, successful, growing organizations and business models do look at that on a regular basis, and they make pivots, as time goes. Um, so let's talk about one-on-ones. What does that look like? How do we help people be accountable so that they can be successful in this environment that we're building, that we, would love for people to thrive in?
Yeah, so you definitely measure what matters. And when people know you're measuring it, then they are going to pay attention to it. The number one thing to keep in mind with supervision or one-on-one is consistency. Consistency in timing and consistency in agenda. There should be a defined date, time, and frequency, definitely biweekly, minimum of biweekly. I don't think you should go any longer than 2 weeks without touching base with your fundraising professional or your sales team. Some people go a month, and I just personally feel that there's just too much that could happen in that amount of time that you can't support them. So you're just getting an after action, report at that time. But the agenda also has to be consistent. And the things that you want to go over on the agenda is you first want to look at how they're spending their time. So you need access to their calendar, and you need to see where they're spending their time is on the things that that matter to them. And so are they spending time doing the activities that is going to achieve the results? Are they having the certain number of meetings that they need to have? Are they doing the certain number of prospect calls? Are they doing the research and the learning and having the physical face-to-face? Are they doing development? How are they spending their time? Those are sort of the plays, if you will. So you definitely have got to look at their time. If you're not looking at their calendar, then you're missing one of the biggest pieces. Where they're spending their time is where you'll see the results. The second is you want to touch base with them on where they are with their goals. And this should be very clear. Where you're spending your time, where you are with your goals. What is your actual versus the goal? What's in the pipeline, right? when you start talking about pipeline, you need to know, if you don't as a leader, they certainly should know. So press them if they're not offering this up. What is their conversion rate? So how many people do they have to have in the pipeline in order to get a sale? Do they prospect 20 and then close 50%? What is it? And does the pipeline support the metrics that they've experienced? The other is the frequency of touch. How many times do they have to interact with this person before they're ready to close the deal? And that's when you can start to see, all right, are they spending their time the right way? Do they have the proper pipeline? Are they achieving the goals? Are they on track? So you always want to ask them what they're forecasting. And salespeople can be one of two ways. They can be incredibly optimistic, or they can completely undersell. And so you just need to know who you're working with, and you need to verify what they're saying by looking at those two things, time and goal. The other thing from a sales funnel is really, what role is marketing playing in that? Who's qualifying the leads? Who's who's generating the leads? The other thing that I would check in, as I mentioned before. So you're looking at how they're spending their time. You're looking at where they are from a sales standpoint, in their pipeline, their sales funnel. The other is, what are they learning? So you have to ask them. They have to continually be learning about their competitors, learning about their individual products, learning about their prospects, learning about their existing clients. They constantly need to be learning. So that's part of what the one-on-one should include, is what have they learned? And then you need to ask them what barriers they're experiencing. You definitely need to know they're experiencing some obstacles. They see some risk. You need to ask about it, because here's where you serve them. Because a leader, as we touched on earlier, a leader is someone who is making decisions and solving problems and providing resources. So you need to ask the question, what resources do you need? What barriers are you experiencing? What risks have you identified, so that you can help make them successful?
Right. And I would think too, some kind of red flags. I mean, you were talking about, them knowing the conversion rate, of how many people they really need in their pipelines to close sales, but also how many touches they need. If it takes way too long to close a sale consistently, then talking about those barriers. But I think something else that's really important too is to really listen to how many times they come up with barriers, because sometimes people get stalled, in that process professionally, where there's something else holding them back. They may not know exactly what it is, but as a leader, you can't always be running into barriers. Every time you have a one-on-one discussion about performance, there can't always be something wrong, And so, one of the things I've always kind of focused on, especially on the fundraising side, is helping people be part of the solution, is to ask them, okay, well, if they say there's a barrier, well, what is your solution for that? Including them in that conversation to help them come up with their own solution in many cases. Because if they're not invested in that as a tool in their toolkit, then, it becomes easy to come and complain about why you can't do your job and why you can't meet your goals. But at some point, you as a professional have to also be part of coming up with solutions for some of that, as part of your performance. I also think that in that process, we've talked about retention and customer relations and donor relations, that, that cultivation process, that relationship building piece, especially with donors, is important. And that's something else to measure as well, is what are we doing after the sale, after their donation? Are we making good on what we promised? If someone's purchasing a service or a product, is it working well? Is it meeting their expectations? If someone's invested funds, are we telling them about the impact? Are we sharing with them what their investment is doing? And then how does that convert into additional referrals? Are customers bringing other people to the table to then purchase from us because they've had such an amazing experience, or they've left a testimonial that, does wonders for us? Or has the donor had such an amazing experience and they feel so good about it, they either make another gift and make it's bigger, and or do they bring additional people to the table of like mind and kind of want to help to make an impact? So those are things I think that are important too to measure, from a performance standpoint, and definitely to be talking about in that one-on-one experience, because I don't know. I've always felt like those are the times where you really kind of get to the guts of what's going on, and you can kind of dissect and look at what is it that is really working and what isn't. And in this specific scenario, what additional tools or things do we need to move this along to be successful, to close the deal. And so I think, a lot of times we kind of focus on what you were saying. It's almost like an after action report. It's like, here's all the things I did in the last week. Here's all the stuff I have coming up. But I know that I, as a leader, and I know you've done this too, really try to focus on what's working, what isn't. Let's take some specific examples and walk me through it so that, number one, you can use it as a opportunity to kind of course correct people professionally and help them be better at their jobs, but also to help them be successful if another person or part of the organization needs to be involved in closing that sale or that deal. So,
Yeah. Well, you definitely, when you're in the one-on-one, you're clear on whatever their goals are. So regardless of, what their client, their book of business is, or their client accounts, whatever's been assigned to them, if it's retention, if it's growth, if it's acquisition, those are the things that you're talking about. But as I'm listening to you and as I'm reflecting on just the things that we've covered today, and again, the experience that we've collectively had over the last 40 years, most
our
of the
hair
time,
should be grayer.
yeah. Most of the time, if you have a problem with your sales team, you've got a problem with your organization. And it's just manifesting in your fundraising efforts. It's just manifesting in your sales metrics. And that could be that you undervalue your people. So you have a culture issue. You've got your salespeople or your
Right.
fundraisers, out there completely unsupported, completely unconnected, and not equipped to do the job. You're just not giving them, what they need. And if they had those proper tools, it could be better. It could be as simple as that you just,
Right.
you've got a culture issue and that you're not resourcing them. Could be that your organization has got a brand issue. It could be that there's not alignment within your organization and you've got a strategy issue. Oftentimes,
Right.
you tell people from a goal setting standpoint what it is that you want them to achieve, but you don't break down how they get there. And if you don't have a defined process, if you're not breaking your goals into bite-sized pieces with actual action, key activities that are going to drive results, that's the conversion rate. That's the way that you're spending your time. You cannot manage them. You cannot refine them. It's like, here's one of the people said, I just have it that I managed at a time said, I'm just good at sales. I'm just good at sales and I just kind of do my thing and I don't need a process. And I said, all right, well, I'm your coach and I need to know what your process is so that I can coach you. So if you don't have a process, if your organization doesn't have a process and that's how you operate, the individual has to have a process so that
Right.
they can be coached and grown and shorten the cycle between the moves or between the interactions in order to get better, to shorten the sales cycle and to achieve more outcomes. So I'll just say, if people are listening and they say, I really have a problem with my fundraising team, I really have a problem with, my sales team, you probably have an issue in the organization that you're ignoring, and it's just
Mhm.
showing up in your fundraising team and in your sales team.
I agree, and I think that's sometimes hard, for businesses or organizations to take a hard look at. That means admitting that there's a problem somewhere, there's an opportunity for, to make things better or different, but it is really important. In the grand scheme of things, it's not fair. It's not fair to any professional within an organization. If the organization or business really isn't willing to look at something that's difficult and make those changes, it's really a disadvantage for anyone that has a position because they're
Well,
going
and
to
you
be
just have to
impacted in
decide.
some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and sorry, the computer had a lag, so I didn't mean to interrupt. You paused on my screen, and I thought it was my opportunity to jump in. I was properly raised, and I have respect
No
for,
opportunity was
but
given.
no opportunity was given, and so I just looked like I was rude and interrupting. But I think as the CEO, or the executive director of an organization, you can't bury your head. Just imagine what's possible when your team is aligned and your strategies are aligned and they're working cohesively and there's lateral awareness. Not only is it going to be a more enjoyable place to work, But people are going to naturally want to invest in you, naturally going to want to buy products from you, and you're going to achieve uncommon results. You're going to gain market share. You're going to be able to grow your organization and achieve your vision and your mission, in ways in which you couldn't even imagine. So this fear of, I'm just going to keep calling it a sales or a fundraising problem because I don't want anyone to kind of come in and look behind the curtain. Like, why prevent? Once you do it, you're going to feel better, and your company's going to be better, and your stakeholders are going to be better. So just pull the curtain back, get it fixed, and watch your sales and your fundraising grow.
Well said. So I just want to remind everybody, if you're watching this, even if you haven't joined us live, if you have any questions about, your sales or fundraising teams, if you're a leader and you're kind of stuck somewhere and you just want to make sure that, what your next steps are, will really help build your organization or business, please reach out to us. We're happy to answer those questions. You can reach me through Facebook or through LinkedIn. We also have a website, www.mybs, M as in Merrill, A as in Apple, B as in boy, S as in Sam.com. And we'll be happy to, reach back out. You can also leave a comment here on Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube, and, we'll be happy to follow up. And Jamie and I are connected at the hip, so, we will both engage with some kind of response. But I do hope that you found the information, helpful. We really love to see sales and fundraising teams thrive, and they really can. It's taking that hard look and being aware of what's happening to really empower your professionals to do their very best. So, Jamie, have anything else to add before we close out?
Just that it won't be painful. I would say for the CEOs or the chief development officer or the head of sales, sometimes people need to hear what you've been saying to them from someone else. And I guess it never fails. As a mother, I always seem to incorporate some sort of experience with my children. But I promise you, I will say the exact same thing to my kids. And then, Meryl will come over and drop some wisdom, and all of a sudden she's profound and they're doing it. It doesn't mean that you don't know the right thing to do. Sometimes your team just needs to hear it from someone else. And we'd love to come in and be either your voice box or be your eyes or be your ears and help support you in walking out the vision that you have for your organization. So I do hope you reach out.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for joining us today and sharing your wisdom. I'm always delighted to have you. And thank you, everyone, for watching. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.